Welcome to an edition of 8 News Then here on the streaming channel. I'm John Langler, your host, as we look back at Southern Nevada history through the people who were there and the people who remember what it was like back then. We are joined this episode by Andy Hafen, former Henderson mayor, and currently with the Henderson Historical Society as the president, I believe, correct?
Yes, correct.
It's nice to meet you, first of all. Thanks for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
How's life not in office? It's been a while now.
I highly recommend retirement. It's wonderful.
I'll look into it.
Yeah.
I might have a few years left. Well, thanks again for coming in.
Okay, thank you.
We were talking before we got started. There's a lot of discussion and effort on talking about Clark County history, Las Vegas history. The Clark County Museum is right on Boulder Highway, obviously.
Right.
But I feel like Henderson history doesn't get talked about enough. It's and I think it's important, and I'm sure you would feel the same way since it's your town. Before we get into sort of how Henderson got started and some of the historical monumental moments, what do you think is Henderson's history? What do you think makes it interesting, and what should people just sort of know about what makes Henderson Henderson?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, John. One, we were born as a result of World War II. And you go back to our history is not shared very much, but we've always been in the shadow of Las Vegas, the big city just down the road from us. But in some respects, I think that's helped us as a city because later on, during my time in office, we were known as a bedroom community, which was fine. And then, of course, the parks and recreations facilities that we have in Henderson, in my opinion, are the best in the whole United States.
In the history of Henderson, even before World War II, and there was the town of Pittman, and there's sort of how one absorbed the other and how that all worked together. When we think of the city of Las Vegas and how the valley started, a lot of the focus is on the Hoover Dam, obviously, and how that led to everything else. So let's walk through the start of Henderson.
Okay.
There was Pittman beforehand. One of us kind of absorbed the other. Obviously,
Right.
Pittman doesn't exist anymore. Essentially, it just is Henderson.
Yeah.
But the sort of seed of Henderson is World War II.
Correct.
And basic.
Right.
Talk about how those intertwined and got Henderson started, because it was basically a tent city, as I recall.
It was. And actually going back to the mining, then that's where Pittman got its start. And it was a smaller unincorporated town, if you will. It really wasn't
just
a city.
a place along the way to Las Vegas,
Right.
basically.
And then
even before then.
And then Hoover Dam comes along, and then the tent city was actually along Boulder Highway, which I think came into existence about 1931. And so that's where Pittman, and then later on, then the basic management plant started, and they actually, with Pittman, the neighborhood grew because it was kind of like an industry or a factory town. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the the Pittman portion. Well, then Henderson comes along, and Pittman is actually probably further ahead in development than Henderson because Henderson was also kind of a war town for the basic magnesium plants. Mm-hmm. And so I think there was like 15,000 people at that plant. And another interesting fact about Henderson that a lot of people, I don't know if they know this or not, but since it was created as a war town, a World War II town, some of the older streets, they're not in the grid pattern. Yeah. Some of the streets go all over the place. And they were painted, I think, like white and purple to kind of blend in with the desert.
Interesting.
So that
because of all the World War II stuff going on, yeah.
And so if bombs or planes came over, it would be hard to really see that.
Really interesting, yeah. Well, and as I think if people are new to Southern Nevada, they're like, why is there a school named Basic? What is Basic? What a strange name. It's because of the company. It's
Correct.
Because of the magnesium that was used in World War II for making everything that was used, engines, planes, weapons, all
Correct.
that stuff.
Yeah.
Henderson was sort of creating all of it. It was enormous.
Right. And so as I said earlier too, so that the town at the time was basically owned by that plant, Basic, and so that's where that name, and Basic High School got its name from that too, which also was like the second high school in Clark County after Las Vegas High School.
Shout out to the Wolverines. So World War II finishes, and based on my research, at that time, Henderson, the plant almost completely winds down, right?
Yeah.
And there's some genuine concern that Henderson will become a ghost town, as so many other parts of Nevada became after the war.
Correct.
You think of the Tonopah airfield. Tonopah exists, of course, but there was an enormous airfield out there that immediately just shut down right after the war. How close did Henderson come to not becoming Henderson?
It was destined for a ghost town because the plants did basically shut down. And thank goodness there were some city fathers, if you will, or leaders that saw an opportunity there, and then that's where Henderson gets its name through Senator Henderson.
The post office was named after him, right? Does that recall?
Could be, and it was just known as Henderson after that too. And then the senator and the legislation that passed for incorporation included the name Henderson, which was kind of interesting because going back to Pittman then too. So Pittman basically agreed, from my understanding at the time, that since we are the residents that own the most land, and Basic Magnesium actually owns the rest of the land, Pittman was needed for Henderson to be incorporated. And so it's been interesting, I think, because they during the incorporation discussions, they decided, we will join forces. They got a city council rep, one, and then, of course, unfortunately, I think they kind of got pushed down into oblivion, if you will.
Henderson politics, even before Henderson even started. Look at that. Who knew? Right from the very beginning here. By the way, our James Schaefer did a whole backstory on the history of Pittman. It's really worth checking out on 8newsnow.com. So Henderson becomes a city early 1950s. And, we think of Old Town Water Street and Henderson, as you're talking about, Van Wagenen and all the streets down there. How long does it take for Henderson to sort of get its feet under itself and become a proper city? It's obviously technically a city, but to sort of find its way through the 50s and grow to what we know now.
So it would have been a good, say, 20, 25 years, because I think the first big break in growth in the city of Henderson came with Green Valley, and that was in the late 70s is when that first got started, and a master plan community, which was kind of a new concept. So that really did give us that opportunity to grow. But from incorporation in 1953 until, the end of the 70s, we were just a small town.
Well, and I think also, you talk about the basic plant, and, back then, and just until recent history, Henderson had sort of an industrial thought process about it. It was based in industry, right? There was the thought of, the sort of the haze that would hang over Henderson and all of that.
35 years ago, the residents of Henderson decided to celebrate. All the commotion was over new industry coming to town. But instead of just one day of festivities, the celebration turned into an event of major proportion, including a parade and a carnival.
I think Industrial Days just kind of sets the tone and style of the community, I think, which shows the community's attitude towards industrial development.
For 8 days, Henderson is wrapped deep in the midst of celebration. One of the event's organizers says this year's Industrial Days is bigger than ever.
It's probably maybe 25% larger. There's 15 separate events that encompass the Industrial Day celebration.
This year's Industrial Days opens Saturday with the Miss Industrial Days beauty pageant. A chili cook-off is scheduled for the next day. Next Wednesday, the carnival opens, and on Saturday is the event of the season, the Industrial Days Parade. And closing things out is the Saddle Club Rodeo, scheduled for Sunday, April 20th. Those are just a few of the activities scheduled throughout the 8-day span of the event. Art Edwards, Eyewitness News 8.
And do you think that was sort of a perception? Was it hard for Henderson to shake that off? Has it been hard for Henderson to shake that off?
It has, and it has shaken it off for sure. But as old-time residents, if you will, I mean, when I was in high school, we were known as the armpit of the nation. And that's terrible because you could smell, the emissions from those plants. And again,
and it was right in town.
And basically in the Pittman area, too. Mm-hmm. So as you'd go down Boulder Highway, and honestly, there was a cloud there, too. So, Henderson stinks. That's kind of what my high school was used to being called.
And, you think there's the basic plant, but there was TriMet,
TIMET.
TIMET, sorry.
Yeah.
TriMet, something very different.
Yeah.
TIMET, sorry, still around. And we'll talk about Pepcon in a second here. But those were the companies. Yes, there was the haze, but that's what kept the city going, essentially, right? That was the foundation of the town.
Correct. And I will tell you, so my father was one of the original business owners. He owned a tire store, opened in the 50s. And I remember growing up when the plants went on strike, when there was not a very much demand for the materials. We felt it as a family, and he could always tell, well, the plants are, they're on a furlough or there's a strike, because it just dried up our business too. So.
A lot of rural Nevada is like that now. When the mines shut down, suddenly people don't need to be in Beatty as much anymore. It comes in and goes, right? By the way, you're watching an episode of 8 News Then here on the streaming channel. I'm John Langler. Greetings. Former Henderson Mayor Andy Hafen is here to talk about the history of Henderson here in Southern Nevada. It's changed a lot in a short amount of time, just like much of the rest of Southern Nevada. So, but We'll talk about Pepcon in a second and how that sort of changed a lot of what happened in the city. But first, Green Valley.
Okay.
Because it's so different from the rest of Henderson. Obviously, it was before Summerlin, really. What do you remember about when Green Valley started? Brian Greenspun and the company and how that sparked not only Henderson, but really a lot of the rest of Southern Nevada.
So I was in high school at the time, and it was kind of a big thing for Henderson. We had this new community that was going to be coming in, Green Valley. But, you talk about Pittman kind of being absorbed by Henderson. It was really interesting because after I was first elected in 1987, Green Valley was really starting to take off. And I remember there was a little bit of, well, we want to be known as Green Valley, Nevada, and especially when they got their zip code.
Yeah.
From 89015 was the Henderson zip code forever, and then 89014. And it took a while, and I think some of the residents then, the early residents, were a little bit embarrassed because of the history of Henderson. But I think as time has gone on, and now that we're second largest city and some of the successes we've had, I haven't heard any of that. So Green Valley is another neighborhood, just like Pittman is another neighborhood.
Well, especially even in the amount of time that when I moved here in 95, there was sort of this mental and geographic break between old Henderson and Green Valley, what maybe we'd call New Henderson. And now it's all sort of one and the same to some extent. Even where Pepcon has all been developed, where the explosion took place. But how much did Henderson need something like Green Valley?
I think that's really what put us on the map, if you will.
Literally.
With Green Valley and then the other master plan communities. I actually served on some national committees in the National League of Cities, which is an organization for city councils. And it was interesting because by the time I got to the end of my service, people were looking at Henderson like, well, how are you guys doing things in Henderson for best practices in that? So that really made me happy as a council member to know that, hey, people were looking at us.
So you're elected to the city council 87, correct?
Correct.
A year later, Pepcon.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, we'll show video here in the program eventually of what took place. An enormous explosion in the south end of the valley. It was a rocket fuel manufacturing facility. It's just sort of right now where the Beltway and Stephanie, I think, would be, or Gibson, right on the south end. So it's where homes are now.
Yeah.
But back then, they weren't there. It was Lake Mead. There was no Beltway. And everybody who was here remembers it. Obviously, you were here. What do you remember about the day of the Pepcon explosion?
So I was actually working with Metro PD at the time, and I was at lunch actually with my lieutenant. And when we left the restaurant, looked up and saw this plume of smoke. And by the time we got back to the office, one of the deputy chiefs said, get your people together because we've had this tremendous explosion. And so I did get permission to actually leave and go out to Henderson to try and see what was going on and if I could be any help there too. But yeah, very vivid, the damage that was caused and how fortunate we were, actually. It's a bad explosion, but I believe there was only 2 people.
Yeah, 2 people lost their lives. There were lots of injuries, lots of property damage as well, even though it was, at that point, kind of remote, right? Pepcon wasn't in the middle of a neighborhood. It was sort of out on its own on Lake Mead.
Yeah.
Oh, it just blew again. It just blew again.
Danger and destruction, shocking and rocking Southern Nevada. May 4th, 1988. The ground shook and a toxic mushroom cloud rose above Henderson when the Pacific Engineering Production Company of Nevada, better known as Pepcon, went up in flames.
And it just spread. It spread so quick, it was unreal.
Frank Quintana was working in maintenance for Pepcon that fateful day.
And it was about 5 minutes to 12, right before lunch.
For Quintana, word of a fire in this rocket fuel plant sparked concern.
And I went to where the fire was at. I got a fire hose, tried to fight the fire.
Within minutes, storage drums filled with ammonium perchlorate, an explosive rocket fuel ingredient, caught fire. Flames spread worse than wildfire. Pepcon was on the verge of catastrophe.
Emergency. We need the fire department. All you can get here.
I say if we'd have got there 2 minutes earlier, I wouldn't be here today.
Henderson Fire Captain Don Griffey traveled toward trouble.
I saw it completely engulfed in flames.
People were running for their lives from Pepcon and the neighboring Kidd & Company marshmallow plant.
That's when the explosion happened.
Running.
Quintana was at ground zero. Where were you when the big explosion took place?
I was right there where the fire originally started. I was trying to fight the fire.
Ooh, that's going to be loud.
From the intense inferno suddenly came the biggest blast of all, sending a violent shockwave rumbling through the desert.
I'm outside the truck, and the next thing I know, I'm up inside the bed of the truck.
That was close. It tore my clothing off, my pants. It ripped my pants. It took me off my shoes. Took my hard hat. Took my safety glasses.
We are back with more of our coverage of the explosion at Pacific Engineering just shortly before noon today.
The Las Vegas Valley had never seen an explosion of this magnitude. Pepcon and the marshmallow plant were leveled. The blast knocked cars off the road, shattered windows, and damaged buildings for miles. When the smoke cleared, the death toll was 2.
We've got a miracle on our hands.
Griffey has a collection of newspapers on the Pepcon disaster, even his fire helmet from that day.
I don't really talk to too many people about it.
But Quintana will never forget surviving the impossible.
Don't know. Lucky.
9 million pounds of rocket fuel shot a ferocious fireball high into the sky. The day Southern Nevada looked like it was the scene of a nuclear nightmare 25 years ago.
Leading up to that, we were talking before about the industrial past of Henderson. What was Pepcon to Henderson at the time in terms of being an important industry, an important business? How vital was what they did to what to the city operations, just employment, things like that?
So obviously they weren't as big as like Time at Stauffer was another one. American Potash was another one. U.S. Lime, but it was all kind of within that geographical area. So yeah, they were an employer of, I don't know if there were hundreds or
it was
50
big
or whatever.
It was rocket fuel.
So yeah,
for the space shuttle. Not
only was it important to the city of Henderson, but as you said, it was important to the national interests too.
What was the aftermath of that? Aside from the damage that was caused, was there a broader impact of this explosion happening at the time? You know, Green Valley's growing, Henderson's growing, the entire valley's growing really, and here this enormous explosion happens that gets everybody's attention. What effect did it have at City Hall?
So there's a couple of things that I think, what I saw that went on. Number one, it was really interesting to see, initially how neighborhoods and how homeowners came together and helped each other out. I mean, there were actually buildings that were the doors blown off, so there was no way to protect them. And you couldn't get plywood up fast enough to secure them. So I was really impressed with that, how close we were as in not only old Henderson, if you will, but everybody looking out for everybody in Green Valley too. But then the other thing kicked in, and the question about, well, do we want these industrial plants, if you will, in the city of Henderson. And it was really kind of hard at that time because that's how Henderson really got its start, if you will, is through industry. And I remember, matter of fact, I think it was Channel 8. I did an interview and kind of caught me off guard, said, well, do you think Pepcon should stay here? And I said, well, yes, they should.
Because they've always been
forever.
there.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the sentiment at the time is no. And unfortunately, that company did actually end up leaving Henderson. I think it went up somewhere in Utah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, St. George, somewhere
Yeah.
a little more rural.
Yeah.
So after Pepcon, again, and it can't overstate how big of a deal it was that everybody in the valley knew what was going on at that time. The city moves forward, and ever since then, really, the city has grown, and a lot of that industry, it's still around, but it's not the same. There's been other aspects of commerce, of business that has sort of taken over Henderson. You were mayor for a fair chunk of that. Tell me about maybe that transition from Pepcon. I know TimeOut's still there, but to the transition from the Henderson haze to to modern Henderson.
Well, and thank goodness for modern technology, because I think there were issues that need to be addressed, and I believe that they were with current inventions or whatever you want to call it, or
just
technology.
Cleaning up.
Exactly. And so it's been very interesting because, yes, that industry has still existed, but I believe it's a lot safer than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even when Pepcon happened in the 80s. And so thank goodness for that. I think that we can still exist with each other, even though there's been a lot of growth around those plants.
And there is industry in Henderson, we should point out, but there's manufacturing, there's a lot of other big companies, there's a lot of tech that's come into Henderson in that time that just doesn't maybe make as much of a visual smokestack footprint as some of the other ones before, which gets to the idea of growth. Again, you were mayor up until 2017, as I recall.
Correct.
And in that time, for years and years, Henderson's been growing. Housing has, just in the time, again, I lived here, the Beltway's been grown, and now Anthem exists, and the homes are as far as the eye can see now. Do you think that Henderson lost some of what made Henderson Henderson in the drive to grow, in appealing to businesses that are maybe not local but from outside, in a way to sort of generate this change?
I really do like that question because, and again, you're talking to somebody that's lived in Henderson his whole life.
Yeah.
But I say in Henderson, the degree of separation isn't 6, it's like 2. I mean, somebody is going to know somebody. And then we come along with our little motto, Henderson, a place to call home. And then, of course, going back to our parks and recreation facilities, I really believe that it is a community, really, that even though now we're the second largest city in Nevada, it still has that old folksy type, neighbors know neighbors and help each other out. And so been very lucky with that. I hope people feel the same way I do about it. I love Henderson.
Do you think it's still a bedroom community?
Well, I think there's probably, and I don't know the stats, we'd have to fact check, of course, but I still think there are a lot of people that probably go to Las Vegas to work. But no, we've come to our own. Interesting, in the 60s, I remember a big thing for us, the first Kentucky Fried Chicken opened up, and we had to drive from Henderson to Las Vegas to go eat a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And now, all that growth, you can't even tell.
Well, and there was no freeway to take you there, right? I mean,
right. Boulder Highway.
That was it, yeah. Let's look ahead to the future, but also consider the past year. You're now with the Henderson Historical Society. We're talking about this idea of preserving Henderson's past. What efforts are underway now to try and remember the past, and whether it's a museum, saving the annex downtown, other aspects of some of the Water Street buildings to keep in place and remember those old school Henderson years?
I really would hope that we as a city and as the city council would realize, and Vegas gets this reputation too.
Oh, sure.
It's there too long, tear it down and build something else. And in some respects that's not bad, but in some respects we really do need to preserve some of that history. some of the old buildings. And, one of the things the Historical Society has tried to push is the original fire station, police station. And a little bit of pushback because it is in an area where, there are casinos now and business makes sense. But I think we need to be careful because history really is meaningful. And if you don't learn from your history, you're not going to have a very good future.
And I mean, I guess I know you're not in elected office anymore, but it must be hard to balance in your position now the idea of preserving history, but at the same time, when you were mayor, the idea was business.
Yeah.
Driving business, encouraging business in the valley. So I find your minds are probably divided right now a little bit.
You got to have a little bit of balance in everything, right? So,
and it's interesting too. You talked about at the very beginning of the start of Henderson, the Three Kids Mine, which is now being redeveloped into houses. Lake Las Vegas is right near there as well. Is that sort of another visual indicator? Even parts of Anthem used to be, I believe, mining, or Black Mountain. Like there's other parts of the south end of the valley that were capped and then built upon.
Always desert, basically.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Not that we need to preserve toxic land sites as Three Kids Mine to some extent is here, but what else could be done maybe to acknowledge the past in Henderson beyond maybe what's done now?
So what we've done as the Historical Society is on about a quarterly basis, we have a program we called Henderson Speaks. And we talk about the history. And I mean, one I can remember what got a lot of interest was when we talked about the police and fire department. Another one was Lake Las Vegas, that history. Pretty soon we'll need to have one on cadence because, you go back to toxic waste. Basically, cadence was just the runoff from the plants. It got cleaned up environmentally. And now look at that great community there, the neighborhood that is being grown. Same way with Anthem and the rest of those up there too. Something
I should have asked you before we were talking about you growing up in Henderson. It's so weird to think about now because the cities essentially are conjoined. It's just one stretch of development through Las Vegas and into Henderson. But when you were growing up, what was the perception in Henderson, or your perception of Las Vegas, of the city, of the Strip? Because I feel like there would be a different perception then than maybe now, because back then there was such a separation.
It's interesting that you would ask that because basically I felt sheltered growing up. I mean, Las Vegas was still, even in the 50s and 60s, the glamour and the glitz and the gambling and the drinking and
Sinatra and the whole thing,
but for me, I was kind of like immune from that because Henderson was just a little tiny, tight-knit community. And as I got older, of course, then that perception changed and I realized what was going on. But yeah, I think we had maybe a couple of bars in Henderson and maybe a couple of casinos, but nothing like Las Vegas.
It's changed quite a bit.
It has.
Former Henderson Mayor Andy Hafen joining us here for the episode of 8 News Then. I appreciate the time. Thank you for shedding some light on Henderson history. Hopefully there are more efforts to preserve it and highlight it in the future. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And we'll see you again on another episode of 8 News Then. Thank you for watching.
Looking forward to it.